If you were to rate your lesson on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very far from ideal and 10 being, the most ideal class, where would you put yourself?
I'm thinking 7 or 8 maybe.
Okay. So what things went well then to contribute to that rating?
A lot of the kids were really engaged and interested in what they were doing. I really like that it was them applying what we've learned in class to a larger concept. We've been doing the project that we've been doing with their model cars. They've done multiple tests related to multiple things that we're learning. So I really like that it's just another piece to tie into that, and that it also allowed them to apply some things that we've learned in the past and bring it back in again with this new, the new stuff that they're learning about Newton's third law, like action and reaction forces.
Okay, so you collected some data at the end of your lesson. Tell me a little bit about what the data says then. How does it support your rating?
Well, I looked over the data, and what I have is I had 25 kids that took this survey of 4 questions. 13 of them got all 4 questions correct. I have 5 that the only thing they got wrong was one question where both options were correct and they only picked one of them.
Okay.
So it wasn't that they were wrong, they just didn't get the other piece as well. So they're kind of almost there. And then I had just 7 of the 25 kids who I feel like I probably need to check in with them in more detail. So like not 100 for everybody, but I feel like we're definitely on the way, and most of them are in a really good place. So that's kind of why I was thinking like a 7 or 8. Like not everyone's there yet, but I didn't necessarily expect us to be either, because we just started talking about this particular idea of collisions and Newton's third law at the beginning of the week. So
Okay.
We're kind of on our way to understanding.
So I have 2 thoughts. The first thought, if you were to get to a 10, if you were to if this was to be your ideal lesson, what would you see the students doing differently?
I feel like they would all really have a good, solid understanding. Some of the issues that we had with just them getting things set up and started and reading directions, I feel like with a level 10 lesson, you need to not have those issues. It needs to be clear, and they need to have a better understanding from the get-go of what they're doing, and whether that's stretching it so that they have to read the directions more closely before we get started, or whether it's chunking it differently or something like that. I feel like a 10 would need that. There was an issue with our data charts. There were too many of them. They weren't organized properly, so I feel like I've already fixed that for the next class. And I just think also all the students being able to really solidly understand how this applies to what we've been talking about with Newton's third law, which you were talking to a couple of the different groups as I went around and checked on kids, and you did note that some really feel like they had a good understanding of how this applied, but didn't know how, but were having trouble, applying it to other scenarios, and others were just, at a level 2 out of 4, weren't quite getting there. So I think a 10, hopefully they'd all have a much better solid understanding of how this applies to the content, and be able to think of other examples that are similar to.
Right.
Which I think was helpful. But then if you also remember, we had to at one point kind of call everyone's attention, and the directions were like so long that, they hadn't set one thing up properly, or they'd missed a step. And so I think whether I might have them, read through and have to write some notes in their science notebook to kind of summarize what they're going to need to do, or have a piece that's printed that they can highlight the important parts, annotate it or something, or maybe give it to them in chunks. I was also thinking, I suggested to one of my teaching partners that what she might like to do is just have them read that first step about setup, and before they get their cars or anything like that, they have to set up their ramp and the wall that their car's going to crash into and everything, and have her approve it first before then they get started. And I was thinking chunking it like that probably would have been better.
So you suggested, sorry, I cut you off. You
okay.
suggested three different strategies, coming up with your own solutions for that. What do you think would be the most realistic for your classroom? Or that particular group, maybe?
For that particular group, I have a feeling that what would be the most helpful is giving them printed that one set of directions for setup, and having them get the materials and set up the ramp and everything first, and before they could go and get started. And if they could have that piece set, and I could have checked in everything, that they had the proper setup, I think that would have really helped them get started, because that was a big stumbling block for a lot of them, because they hadn't set it up properly. It meant that when they were trying to do the other steps, like collect data, they didn't, if their setup's not properly, they didn't know what to do. Like, it confused them even more.
Okay. And so the second thing that I would love to talk about further is you're mentioning the checking for understanding as they're working. So you had your check for understanding at the end of the class,
yes,
where you see that most of the students seem to meet the targets that you had set for the period, but that there were still a group of students that weren't able to either get a perfect score or close to a perfect score. What would your classroom look like if you were able to provide those opportunities throughout the period, those small check for understanding?
I think it might have been helpful for me before they went and set up, because if you remember, you came in and we watched a couple of videos and had some discussions first about like crash test dummies and stuff. And then they did a collision simulation as well. And it might have been good to maybe have a little quick Google form with a question or two after that, before they went and started the lab, so then I could quickly see, okay, once we get started and set up, I need to check with these, 5 kids closely first to get them on a better start. And so I think having something like that right before we started, like 20 minutes into the lesson, would have let me give a good starting point about who to talk to. And then also having some questions, like a few set questions that I would be going around to talking to individual kids or different groups about, to make sure that they answered, whether it's asking them, like as you did, what does this have to do? What have we been learning in class? What does this lab have to do with that? Can you apply this to another real life context? So, maybe having a few questions like that, even those 3, then that would allow me to, if I have just like a clipboard, I could be taking notes as I go in and check individually with different kids. So then I would have like an initial check before we did the lab, and then a check that I'm kind of doing as I circulate while we do the lab, and then the final check for understanding at the end.
Okay.
And that might have been a lot. I would have had a much better pulse on kind of where everyone was, I think, if I had set it up like that maybe, rather than just at the end.
So could that be a goal for you?
I think that would be great, because with these 2-hour blocks and some of these projects that we have been doing, you really do need to have multiple checks for understanding in there. And I also think when I'm circulating and they're working in groups, it's probably better to have a few set questions that I have thought ahead of time to ask. And I'll get much better information from that than just saying, so how you doing? Or do you have any questions? When you're too general, I feel like you don't get as good enough information back from the kids. So thinking ahead of time what I might want to ask them would probably be really helpful too.
If you were to set that as a goal, and if we were to work on that together, how might we measure the impact on learning in your classroom?
I think how with some of these checks for understanding, like surveys, kind of seeing if I see a better improvement in everyone's understanding of what we're doing. like right now, I only had 13 of the 20, well, still more than half, but 13 of the 25 kids got all 4 questions correct. I have a feeling that if I had these other checks for understanding, like having them rate themselves, having them set a goal for within that class period, asking some of these set questions, I think that if I were to implement that, then I would probably have even more kids being able to answer most of the questions, like, and really hit those few things that I want them to be able to get.